Hello, BookTube. I want to have another go at Sword and Sorcery. Yesterday, for Tag Tuesday, I did a Sword and Sorcery tag, and while I'm quite happy with it, I wish I had been more expensive. I didn't talk about my history with Sword and Sorcery, my love of Sword and Sorcery, where I think Sword and Sorcery can go the next time there's a big resurgence in Sword and Sorcery. So, yeah. I kind of would like to have another go at it, so I think this video will serve as that, hopefully. But then again, I might have more I want to say later on. Typical, I mean, there are countless videos I think about later that I'm like, oh, I should have said that, or I should have mentioned that, or, yeah. Anyway, so let's get to work on talking a little bit more about Sword and Sorcery. So, what is Sword and Sorcery? I think Steve Donahue in his video did a pretty good job of explaining it. Basically, Sword and Sorcery is one of the earliest subgenres of fantasy. It does predate epic fantasy by a good number of years. Robert E. Howard's Conan and Cole stories were first published in 1929, 1930s, and I think, and Lord of the Rings proper wasn't published until the 50s. Although we can argue, I guess, about the Hobbit. And really, the Lord of the Rings really codified what epic fantasy is and will be moving forward, although that's been changed over succeeding decades, while Sword and Sorcery really hasn't had as much, I guess, change in the basic formula of the story, which is an outsider, or sometimes not, but usually a swords person encounters some form of supernatural antagonist, and using their wits and their skill and their strength overcomes it. And the stakes are not necessarily planetary or epic in the sense of, like, say, Sauron taking over the world or something. It's usually evil wizards up to something and very small scale, and hero takes care of him. Or hero's a thief and stealing from the wizard or whatever. So, yeah. So, how did I first get in with Sword and Sorcery? That honestly was movies. When I was very young, I watched Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Destroyer starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Also Beastmaster. I was the period when basically HBO was, hey, Beastmaster's on. Or TBS with the Beastmaster station. Basically, at the time, HBO and TBS would basically air Beastmaster and a lot of these other Sword and Sorcery films repeatedly ad nauseum. And we had them on VHS, so I watched them fairly religiously. Also, like Red Sonja, because I want to say it was, the two Conan films, Red Sonja, Beastmaster, Masters of the Universe, even though that is more science fantasy, I think we had on VHS, and then we would rent a tour, largely just for the giant spider, and others. So, and then gradually, not only did watching those Sword and Sorcery movies from the 80s get me into Sword and Sorcery and fantasy, also He-Man and the Masters of the Universe and She-Ra, Princess of Power, were major cartoons in the 80s that I adored. So, getting back. So, not only did Sword and Sorcery film and He-Man and She-Ra get me into fantasy, it also got me into history, particularly ancient history. A lot of my interest in pre-Roman history, pre-Bronze Age collapse history is rooted in my love of sword and sorcery. Because the Hyborian Age of Conan is essentially like before these civilizations, but are very much inspired by these civilizations. Not exactly, but to a large extent. And the Hyborian Age is the setting of the Conan stories. Yeah, so, and then gradually I would like watch the films. And one of my first comic books, which I'll touch on when I eventually talk about my history in comics, was a Conan, the Barbarian comic. Don't remember much about it, but it was a Conan comic. And then gradually I also started buying fantasy novels, particularly the Conan pastiches. Conan the Hero by Leonard Carpenter, Roland Green, others, Robert Jordan, who I have him, I think he's on this, no, he's down here, with Conan's Mighty Thews on the cover. So, yeah, I mean, and then eventually when I was a little older, I finally got into the Robert E. Howard Conan stories, which I have the collected editions in the Del Rey 3 volumes here, which I wanted to actually show yesterday, so kind of like try to get the like the thumbnail to show, but yeah, I completely forgot to, which one of the areas where I was kind of excoriating myself about yesterday's video. So then I read the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard, absolutely loved them, and then gradually started to pick up like Michael Moorcock's Elric stories, the Sword and Sorcery anthology of the Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, that Swords and Dark Magic, and on and on. I mean, I'm not as really sort of super into, well, let me backtrack some. I'm not really a super fan. Basically, like every bit of Sword and Sorcery I've read, aim to read, or want to collect. I mean, I've read a bunch, but not necessarily a huge amount. I mean, there's a wider array of particularly like Spinnerack fantasy that would be probably Sword and Sorcery that I've never heard of and probably won't, get to. But anyway, but I do really like Sword and Sorcery. Obviously, the story that I'm working on right now, Akarja, is ideally Sword and Sorcery. The stakes are very, very personal, so it is. Although in my case, I'm writing it from the typical antagonist side because I much prefer the wizard than I do the swordsman. I'm weird. Anyway, but I've always been more fond of or interested in the magic and the sorcerer than I have been in the swordsman, or the hero of a sword and sorcery story. Certainly, but I got to thinking a bit more. I'm not honestly happy with the question about how sword and sorcery is an un-PC genre, which means that there are a lot of elements of sword and sorcery, whether it's because of the fact that it's very much cyclical in its popularity, or just something about the genre that really makes it more conservative relative to other subgenres of fantasy or science fiction in general. And I got to thinking about that to a certain extent, and particularly how the genre can adapt. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So, why exactly does Sword and Sorcery seem to be relatively more reactionary? Very much, there's this image of the hero who is usually male, and arguably perhaps a quite toxic image of masculinity. Or at least, if not handled very well, it can be considered a sort of toxic masculinity, or sort of a wish fulfillment by related to toxic masculinity. At the same time, female characters are, particularly in visual media, depicted with rather skimpy and not entirely useful armor, the chainmail bikini, which of course, is geared more towards fan service, which is a term that basically describes a character who is presented in such a way as to be attractive, to get the reader, the viewer, a little enticed. And while, male characters are also often as skimpily dressed, Conan basically wears briefs through good chunks of Conan the Barbarian, both of them, Conan the Destroyer, Dar the Beastmasters running around in a loincloth, but it's not as sexualized, or not usually as sexualized. It can be, but usually not. So I think that's where a lot of the NPC-ness of the genre comes from, both visually and to a lesser extent in the prose. The prose, the fiction, usually I think a lot of its problems come from relative to whether it's PC or offensive, is usually that Sword and Sorcery in print is very cyclical in popularity. You have the first flowering with, or really the invention of the genre with Robert E. Howard and C.L. Moore and some of the works of Clark Ashton Smith in the 30s. And then you really have nothing. You have a little bit of the Conan pastiches of Elsbrach de Camp and Len Carter, but then you really don't have much in the way of new material coming out until like the 60s with some of Michael Moorcock's Elric stories, and then a few decades later, in I think the 70s, with Len Carter's Flashing Swords and the writers who appear in those anthologies, and I think they kind of formed a sort of little Sword and Sorcery Writers Guild that I'm blanking on what the name of it was, but yeah, and then they kind of faded out by the 80s, and then like there were the Conan pastiches, but I don't know, there really was a whole lot of new material. And then certainly I think in like the 90s and early 2000s, you didn't have much until I think a little bit towards the end of the 2000s and beginning of the 2010s. You had a little flourishing with like James Ing and the Blackgate magazine, which Blackgate is currently it's a blog site where a lot of bloggers basically write about whatever they want to. Originally, it was a magazine that focused on generally a bit more sword and sorcery type short fiction. There are others currently. I think Beneath Ceaseless Skies, I think, has some. Grimdark, I think Heroic Quarterly. Although don't quote me on that. I really didn't do a whole lot of immediate research for this. I'm just basically talking. So I could be wrong. But yeah. And then the Swords and Dark Magic, which really looked at newer, more contemporary sword and sorcery stories. And then I think there's maybe hints of a resurgence the last few years. I know I mentioned Ashante Wilson's Sorcerer of the Wildeeps, also his A Taste of Honey, I think would count as Sword and Sorcery. So I would also posit or argue that Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James is probably more sword and sorcery than epic fantasy. I know there's a bit of, obviously the fate of empires, the fate of kingdoms, but really, if you boil it all down, it's basically, a mercenary hired to find a missing kid and then seeking revenge after his family's killed years later. Sorry for the spoilers, but it's really, I would argue, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, showing it again, is really sword and sorcery more than it is epic fantasy. And I think that to a degree, that might actually be, and also Ashante Wilson's novels, I think really are ways of pushing the genre forward. But a lot of the thing with sword and sorcery is, or particularly I think as far as the fiction's concerned, is that it very much that cyclical, so that the fans tend to really gravitate towards the older works, and then basically their tastes are set, and then you have a new work coming out, and it might be, in a lot of cases, pushing the genre forward, or sometimes really just staying in its lane, I guess. So, a lot of it depends. There's a lot of really good work that is pushing the genre forward. Particularly Black Leopard, Red Wolf, Ashante Wilson's stories. Would love to see some more of those. Definitely would. And I think that's really where maybe the genre can be headed is, not only a more diverse cast, but also ways of telling the story, while also very much keeping sort of the core narrative of what a sword and sorcery is, which is really a hero encountering the supernatural for personal stakes. And you can do so much with that. Even with the earliest genre, you had, not long after Conan, you had Jirel of Joiry. You had Charles Saunders Imaro in the 70s. So there was a whole Sword and Sorceress. There was a series of Sword and Sorcery stories written by women, edited by Marion Zimmer Bradley, even though she might be more properly known as She Who Must Not Be Named. There's a whole thing about her that's very horrific. That came out a few years ago, and pretty much how exactly you touch on that, yeah. I still have some of her work. Mists of Avalon, and I think one or two of the Darkover novels. But haven't read them, and I'm not entirely sure. That's I think how I deal with, or how I should deal with problematic or outright evil writers, particularly once it's been revealed that they're evil or they've committed evil acts. But anyway, so hoping, yeah. So getting back to the point, I really would like to see Sword and Sorcery incorporate a wider array of character types, and like how you can do their stories. Because there's a lot you can do, really, and also maybe ways of telling the story that might push the genre forward. Although, of course, a lot of that is also trying to do something new. Anyway, so I've, excuse me, nattered on for quite some time, so I think I'll wrap it up here. Yeah, so let me know what you think of this video. I've been, I think, cautious, maybe overly cautious, to do these types of videos where I just have a topic and then just go with it, whether I do any research or I'm just nattering off on my own. So let me know what you think, and maybe if I'm not sounding too, whatever, maybe I can do a few more, particularly if I get more confident in doing it, or in making these types of videos. So anyway, I'm going to sign off now. I have some relatives coming over in a few minutes probably, so I'm gonna have to go get ready, and I will see you maybe later on, either with a comic book video or maybe a writing video if I don't have anything else to do. So no, BookTube, I will talk to you later. Thank you. Have a great day, afternoon, and please stay safe.